circa 475 BCE, the outskirts of Ephesus. The first sensation is the smell, an overpowering stench of ammonia, damp earth, and sickness that clings to the hot, still air. It is a smell of decay, a primal odor of life turning back into mud. Then comes the sight, a tableau of such grotesque absurdity it borders on the divine or the demonic. Under the unforgiving Ionian sun, in a ditch by the roadside, lies a man encased from the neck down in a thick, drying carapace of cow manure. His face, gaunt and skeletal, is a mask of dried filth and sweat, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity that seems to belong to another world. This is not a beggar or a madman from the gutters. The shadow of a former nobility, a profound, arrogant intelligence, still flickers in those eyes. This is Heraclitus, the scion of kings, the philosopher who claimed to have deciphered the operating manual of the cosmos. He is dying. His body is bloated with dropsy, a grotesque accumulation of fluid, a mockery of his own philosophy of a dry soul being the wisest. He has prescribed himself this bizarre treatment, hoping the heat of the dung will draw out the malevolent wetness from his failing body. This is the sensory assault of his end, the thick, oppressive heat, the buzzing of flies drawn to the filth, the rasping sound of his own breath, and the profound, crushing silence of his solitude. He is an island of intellectual fire, drowning in a sea of his own fluid, caked in the excrement of the beasts he preferred to men. Here lies the ultimate paradox, the core of our story. The man who saw the hidden unity in all things dies in the most profound state of separation imaginable. He who understood that the universe is governed by a divine, rational principle, the Logos, ends his days in an act of spectacular irrationality. His final moments are not a quiet passing in a scholar's study, but a bizarre, humiliating spectacle on the fringe of the very society he so relentlessly scorned. To understand how a mind that touched the eternal could meet such a squalid end, we must ask the question that haunts his legacy. This is the narrative of him, the man they would call the obscure one, the riddler, the weeping philosopher. This was the saga of Heraclitus of Ephesus, a mind of pure fire in a world of damp clay. To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him and grapple with the central dramatic paradox of his existence. Why did the philosopher who discovered the fundamental laws of the universe, the very rhythm of being, become a reviled outcast? How could the sage who saw the beautiful, tense harmony in the unity of opposites, life and death, war and peace, love and hate, live a life of such utter, relentless discord? His entire philosophy was a hymn to connection, to the hidden web that binds all things. Yet he died profoundly, willfully disconnected. He burned in the very fire of his own insight. He was a physician of the soul who could diagnose the sickness of all humanity, but could not cure himself, instead choosing to wall himself off from the world he claimed to understand so perfectly. Was it a flaw in his character, an unbearable arrogance that curdled his wisdom into poison? Or was it a flaw in the world itself, a world so deaf, so asleep, as he would say, that it was incapable of hearing his truth? The story of Heraclitus is not merely the biography of a pre-Socratic thinker. It is a timeless tragedy about the price of genius, the terrifying isolation of a mind that sees too much, too clearly, and the eternal conflict between the prophet and the mob. His life poses a terrifying question. What if grasping the ultimate truth of reality makes it impossible to live in it? He offered humanity a key to the cosmos, but it was forged in a fire so hot it consumed him first. leaving behind only the cryptic fragments of his genius and the smoking ruin of his life. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the late 6th century BCE, a world crackling with tension, a true tinderbox of empires and ideas. This was not a tranquil age for quiet contemplation. This was the Ionian coast, the vibrant, violent frontier between two worlds, the ancient, monolithic power of the Persian Empire to the east, and the fractious, explosive energy of the nascent Greek city-states to the west. From his perch in Ephesus, a wealthy trading hub perched precariously on this fault line, Heraclitus would have felt the tremors of this impending collision his entire life. To the east, the Achaemenid Empire under Darius the Great was a juggernaut, a centralized, absolute monarchy that had swallowed kingdoms from the Indus Valley to Egypt. Its power was a palpable presence. Its satraps ruled the nearby inland regions, and its demand for tribute was a constant source of resentment for the fiercely independent Greeks of the coast. To the west, the Greek world was a chaotic laboratory of political experimentation. Athens was taking its first unsteady steps toward democracy. Sparta was a militaristic anomaly, and the Ionian cities like Miletus, Samos, and his own Ephesus were ruled by a volatile mix of tyrants, oligarchs, and burgeoning democratic factions. This was the geopolitical chessboard, and Heraclitus's life unfolded right at its unstable center. He lived to see the outbreak of the Ionian Revolt in 499 BCE, a desperate, doomed uprising against Persian rule that would culminate in the burning of Sardis and, in retaliation, the utter destruction of Miletus, the intellectual heart of Ionia. He saw war, not as an aberration, but as the norm. He saw cities rise and fall, empires expand, and entire peoples displaced. This constant state of flux, of violent becoming, was not merely a political backdrop for Heraclitus. It was the raw data for his philosophy. The world was literally on fire, and he saw in that conflagration the fundamental principle of the cosmos. He was not a man born of the common clay he so despised. His veins ran with the blood of kings, a fact that was both his birthright and his curse. Heraclitus was born into the highest echelon of Ephesian aristocracy, a member of the royal clan that traced its lineage back to Androclus, the mythical founder of the city. This was not just a nominal title, it came with a specific, powerful, and hereditary role, the office of Basileus, or king, a high priesthood with significant religious duties connected to the cult of Demeter Eleusinia. In a city like Ephesus, where religion, politics, and commerce were deeply intertwined around the colossal temple of Artemis, this was a position of immense prestige and influence. He was born to be a pillar of the establishment, a guardian of tradition, a master of ceremonies that bound the city together. And yet, his entire life was a rejection of this inheritance. To understand the paradox of Heraclitus, we must start here, with his first and most shocking public act, his abdication. According to the chronicler Diogenes Laertius, Heraclitus, upon coming of age, voluntarily and contemptuously relinquished his right to the kingship, passing it to his younger brother. This was not an act of humility. It was an act of supreme intellectual arrogance. He was turning his back on the highest honor his city could bestow, declaring that the world of ritual, tradition, and civic duty was beneath him. He was trading the ceremonial robes of a priest-king for the threadbare cloak of a philosopher, choosing a kingdom of the mind over a temporal one. This act forged his character. It severed him from the expectations of his class and set him on a path of self-imposed exile long before he physically left the city. It was his declaration that the established order, the world his ancestors had built, was a sham, a game for children. Indeed, legend has it that after this great renunciation, he was found playing knucklebones with the boys near the temple, and when his fellow aristocrats admonished him, he snarled back, "You wretches, what are you wondering at? Is it not better to do this than to engage in politics with you?" His first foray into the public sphere was not an attempt to share wisdom, but a declaration of intellectual war. Having shed the skin of the priest-king, he emerged as a new kind of figure, one for which the world had little precedent. He did not found a school like Pythagoras, or engage in public debate like the sophists who would come later. Instead, he crafted a weapon, a book, a single scroll, reportedly titled On Nature, which he filled with pronouncements of such deliberate and maddening obscurity that it earned him his enduring nickname, the Obscure One. This was a calculated strategy. The style was the message. He wrote in dense, poetic, and paradoxical aphorisms, short bursts of insight that defied easy interpretation. The way up and the way down are one and the same. The hidden harmony is better than the obvious. Nature loves to hide. This was not the writing of a man trying to build a following or enlighten the masses. It was the work of a man setting a brutal intellectual entrance exam for the entire world, and he was certain nearly everyone would fail. He believed that the ultimate truths of the universe could not and should not be laid bare for the undiscerning mob. He compared the Logos, the divine reason governing all things, to gold, and believed that just as donkeys would prefer garbage to gold, the common man would always prefer the rubbish of conventional opinion to the precious metal of truth. His book was a filter, designed to snare the few minds capable of deep thought while repelling and mystifying the many. He was creating a new kind of aristocracy, not of blood, but of intellect, with himself as its sole, self-appointed king. This first public act was therefore an act of profound separation, a gauntlet thrown down before his fellow citizens. He was not saying, "Let me teach you," but rather, "I possess a truth so profound you are unworthy of understanding it." It was a posture guaranteed to provoke resentment and confirm his own isolation, a self-fulfilling prophecy of intellectual solitude that would define the rest of his life. What drove this man to such a radical, self-isolating intellectual stance? It was not a desire for fame, which he scorned, nor wealth which he was born into and relinquished. His inner demon, his secret motivation, was a singular, all-consuming obsession, the pursuit of the Logos. This Greek word is famously difficult to translate. It means word, reason, principle, account, the underlying order of the cosmos. For Heraclitus, the Logos was the most important discovery in human history, and he believed he was the first to have truly found it. He saw himself as a lone beacon of wakefulness in a world of sleepwalkers. Although this Logos is eternal, he proclaimed, men are always incapable of understanding it, both before they hear it and when they have heard it for the first time. This was the core of his tragedy and his arrogance. He believed he had awoken to the fundamental nature of reality, while everyone else, from the common shopkeeper to the celebrated poets like Homer and Hesiod, whom he openly mocked, was stumbling around in a dream, mistaking their private fantasies for the shared reality. His quest was to articulate this Logos, this hidden harmony that governs all the strife and flux of the world. He felt the universe was not a random chaos, but a structured, rational process, a cosmic fire that measures its kindling and its extinguishing. This conviction became an all-consuming fire in his own mind. It was a truth so blindingly obvious to him that the inability of others to see it was not just a source of frustration, but a profound insult. It fueled his misanthropy, his belief that most people were no better than cattle, living as if they had a private understanding of their own. This was his inner demon, the terrible burden of being the only one awake in a world of the sleeping dead, a prophet whose revelation was met not with anger or debate, but with the dull, uncomprehending stare of the ignorant. His most fateful encounter, the one that would define his path, was not with a great teacher or a powerful patron, but with the faceless, formless entity he most despised, the mob. This was not a single event, but a continuous, grinding confrontation with the collective citizenry of Ephesus. We must imagine him in the agora, the bustling heart of the city, a space filled with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, politicians debating, and citizens gossiping. Into this cacophony steps Heraclitus, not to engage in dialogue, but to issue pronouncements, to drop his cryptic, challenging aphorisms like stones into a placid pond. He watches them pray to idols, as if one were to carry on a conversation with houses, completely missing the divine that permeates all of reality. He listens to them quote the great poets, whom he dismisses as fools who didn't understand that day and night are one. He observes their political squabbles and legal proceedings, which he sees as the petty games of children oblivious to the true cosmic justice of strife. The reaction, inevitably, was a wall of incomprehension. They were not equipped to understand his radical ideas. His declaration that war and peace were two sides of the same coin would have sounded like madness to a people living under the constant threat of the Persian Empire. His assertion that all things are in flux, that you cannot step into the same river twice, would have seemed like a denial of common sense. Their reaction, a mixture of ridicule, confusion, and dismissal, became a mirror for Heraclitus. In their blank faces, he saw the confirmation of his darkest beliefs about humanity. He saw the sleeping masses, deaf and blind to the logos that was all around them. This continuous failed encounter was the crucible in which his contempt was forged. It convinced him that humanity was a lost cause, and that his only choice was to turn his back on it completely, to retreat into the fortress of his own mind, a kingdom where he was the only citizen and the only king. This was the encounter that sealed his destiny as an outcast. To truly grasp the core of his thought, we must transport ourselves to the banks of a river, perhaps the Meander or the Caister, which snaked its way past the great city of Ephesus. This is the setting for his most famous and most misunderstood idea. It is a scene of pure sensory immersion. Picture Heraclitus, a solitary figure standing at the water's edge. He feels the dampness of the earth beneath his feet, hears the constant, soft roar of the current, and watches the play of sunlight on the rippling surface. He sees twigs, leaves, and bits of debris being swept along in the ceaseless flow. He dips his hand into the water, feeling the powerful, cold tug of the stream. It is in this moment of intense, direct experience that the philosophical bombshell explodes in his mind. The river is. It has a name, a form, a constant presence in the landscape. And yet, the water that constitutes it is never the same from one moment to the next. The river is a perfect paradox, an enduring identity composed of perpetual change. This is the birth of Panta Rhei. Everything flows. He realizes with the force of a divine revelation that this is not just about rivers. This is the fundamental law of the universe. Nothing is static. Everything is in a constant state of becoming, a perpetual transition from one state to another. You cannot step into the same river twice, he famously declared, because by the time you pull your foot out and put it back in, both you and the river have changed. This insight was a radical departure from the thinking of his Milesian predecessors, who searched for a stable primary substance, water, air, the infinite, out of which everything was made. Heraclitus declared that the ultimate reality was not a substance at all, but a process, the process of change itself. This was the beginning of his war against the static, a war that would soon bring him into conflict with a powerful new philosophical adversary. While Heraclitus was in Ephesus formulating a philosophy of radical flux, a different and profoundly opposing worldview was taking root across the Greek world in the Italian colony of Ionia. This was the antagonist on the grand, macro level of ideas, the rise of the Eleatic school and its formidable champion, Parmenides. If Heraclitus's universe was a raging bonfire of becoming, Parmenides's was a perfect, eternal, motionless crystal sphere. The philosophical duel between these two men, though they likely never met, defined the central debate of their era and for centuries to come. Parmenides, through rigorous, cold logic, argued that change was an illusion. He started from a simple premise: it is, being is, and non-being is not. From this, he deduced that what is must be eternal. It could not come from nothing, indivisible, for what would divide it, and motionless, for where would it move to if it encompasses everything? Therefore, all the change we perceive with our senses, the flowing rivers, the crackling fires, the cycle of birth and death, is a deception, a flaw in our mortal perception. The true reality, accessible only through pure reason, is a single, unchanging, undifferentiated one. This was a direct and total assault on the very foundation of Heraclitus's thought. For Heraclitus, the senses were the gateways to truth, and the evidence of change was everywhere. For Parmenides, the senses were liars, and logic was the only path. It was a titanic clash between two ways of knowing: the dynamic, empirical, and paradoxical vision of Heraclitus versus the static, rationalist, and monolithic vision of Parmenides. This conflict was the great intellectual war of the 5th century BCE, forcing all subsequent philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, to wrestle with the problem of change and permanence. Heraclitus, the champion of becoming, suddenly found himself facing a powerful intellectual enemy who argued that his entire world of fire and strife was nothing but a mirage. The intellectual forge for Heraclitus was the bustling, chaotic Ephesian marketplace, a microcosm of the cosmic strife he so revered. It is here we can witness a dramatic vignette, a scene of discovery that reveals the second pillar of his thought: the unity of opposites. Imagine him walking through the crowded stalls, his senses assaulted by the smells of spices and sweat, the sounds of haggling merchants and craftsmen at work. His gaze falls upon two figures. The first is a bowmaker, a Scythian perhaps, stringing a composite bow. He watches the man struggle, bending the rigid wooden limbs in one direction to attach the string, creating a state of immense, latent tension. The bow, at rest, is a thing of potential violence, its power derived from the opposition between the wood pulling one way and the string pulling the other. Not far away, he sees a musician tuning a lyre. He plucks a string, and the resulting note is a harmony, a beautiful, stable sound created by the tension of the string being stretched between two opposing points of the instrument's frame. In this moment, Heraclitus grasps a profound, universal principle, which he calls the palinthropos harmoniae, the backward-turning harmony, or the harmony of tension. He realizes that the bow and the lyre are the same. Their function, their very essence, comes from a state of strife, a pulling in opposite directions. From this concrete observation, he makes a breathtaking intellectual leap. This isn't just about bows and lyres, it's about everything. The road up and the road down are one and the same. Seawater is the purest and the most polluted. For fish, drinkable and life-giving. For men, undrinkable and destructive. Life and death, sickness and health, good and evil. They are not warring armies, one to be victorious over the other. They are the two ends of the same stick, inseparable partners in a cosmic dance of tension. This idea was deeply unsettling to the conventional Greek mind, which sought clear distinctions and stable definitions. Heraclitus was declaring that reality is fundamentally paradoxical, that harmony does not arise from eliminating conflict, but is the product of it. The bloody, chaotic laboratory that proved Heraclitus's most radical theories right was the Ionian Revolt. Beginning in 499 BCE, this desperate uprising of the Greek cities of Asia Minor against the overwhelming might of the Persian Empire was the defining political event of his lifetime. While his contemporaries saw it as a catastrophe, a whirlwind of political intrigue, broken alliances, and ultimately brutal suppression, Heraclitus saw it as a magnificent, large-scale confirmation of his central doctrine. Polemos pater panton. War is the father of all. He watched as the rebellion, sparked by the ambitions of the Milesian tyrant Aristagoras, engulfed the entire region. He would have heard the reports of the Greek army marching inland and putting the Persian regional capital of Sardis to the torch, a colossal act of defiance that made the conflict irreversible. Then he would have witnessed the inevitable, grinding Persian counterattack. He saw how the crucible of war tested men and cities, elevating some to glory and reducing others to slavery and ash. As the Persian fleet, reinforced by their Phoenician vassals, systematically crushed the rebellion, culminating in the horrific sack of Miletus in 494 BCE, its men killed, its women and children enslaved, its great temples razed, Heraclitus did not see a tragedy to be mourned. He saw the universe at work. War is the father of all and king of all, he proclaimed, and some he shows as gods, others as men, some he makes slaves, others free. For him, strife was the ultimate arbiter, the violent sorting mechanism that reveals the true nature of things. It was not an evil to be avoided, but the very engine of existence, the cosmic justice that creates order out of chaos by assigning every element its proper place. The burning cities were not a sign that the cosmos was broken. They were a sign that it was working exactly as it should. This terrifying vision placed him utterly at odds with the hopes and fears of his fellow Greeks, who prayed for peace and stability. Heraclitus was the philosopher who looked into the abyss of violence and saw not chaos, but a terrible, beautiful order. The culmination of his life's work, the single greatest triumph of his ferocious intellect, was the completion of his book. After years of solitary contemplation, of plumbing the depths of his own soul and observing the world with an unsparing eye, he distilled his entire worldview into one scroll. We must imagine the gravity of this act in a world where books were rare and precious objects, where philosophical ideas were more often transmitted orally. This book was his legacy, his challenge, his final word to a world he felt was not ready for it. And the manner in which he unveiled it was the ultimate expression of his philosophy and his personality. He did not seek a publisher or a patron. He did not gather disciples to study his words. He did not deposit it in a public library for the edification of the masses. Instead, He made a gesture of supreme and theatrical arrogance. He walked through the streets of Ephesus, past the agora where he was mocked, past the homes of the politicians he despised, and ascended the hill to the site of the city's sacred heart, the great temple of Artemis. This was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a colossal structure of marble, a center of pilgrimage and finance for the entire Mediterranean. It was a space that transcended the petty politics of the city. It was a house for a goddess. Here, in the sacred precinct, before the image of the great mother goddess, Heraclitus deposited his life's work. This act was laden with meaning. It was a sacred offering, a message intended not for his contemptible human contemporaries, but for the divine, for posterity, for the few wise souls of the future who might be worthy of it. He was entrusting his logos to the care of a goddess, placing it beyond the reach of the profane. It was his greatest triumph, a moment of pure, unadulterated intellectual self-assurance, and at the same time, his definitive act of separation from the human community. He had spoken his truth, and he was now leaving it for the gods to judge. In that moment of triumph, as he left his scroll in the cool marble sanctuary of the Artemision, we must attempt to reconstruct the psychology of his hubris. What was he thinking? The answer lies in one of his most revealing and audacious fragments, Edisezamen emeuton. I have searched myself. This is the cornerstone of his intellectual pride and the seed of his profound isolation. In an age where wisdom was sought from teachers, from traveling to Egypt or the East, or from divine revelation through oracles, Heraclitus made a revolutionary claim, that the source of all truth lay within. He believed he needed no external authority, no master, no tradition. The universe was not a collection of external facts to be learned, but a structure, a logos, that was mirrored in the depths of the human soul, the psyche. And the psyche, he declared, had a logos so deep you could never discover its limits, even if you traveled every road. This was the source of his incredible self-sufficiency. He saw other great thinkers as mere collectors of information, polymaths like Pythagoras or Hesiod, who learned many things but did not have understanding. He believed he had bypassed mere learning and had grasped understanding itself. This psychology of triumph was a double-edged sword. It gave him the intellectual courage to formulate one of the most original and enduring philosophical systems in history. But it also bred a profound contempt for anyone who had not undertaken the same terrifying journey of self-exploration. If the truth is within everyone, he reasoned, then their failure to find it is their own fault. They are lazy, stupid, and willfully blind. His triumph was therefore entirely solitary. He felt he had climbed a mountain that no one else had even attempted, and from its summit, he looked down on the rest of humanity scurrying about in the valleys below, not with pity, but with pure, unadulterated scorn. He had searched himself and found the cosmos. He looked at others and found only dust. His sworn enemy was not a rival philosopher or a foreign king. It was the people of his own city, the Ephesians. His contempt for them was not a generalized philosophical disdain for the ignorant masses, but a specific, personal, and venomous hatred. He saw in their burgeoning democracy and their daily lives the epitome of everything he found repulsive in humanity. This was a close-up, a deeply personal conflict that fueled the fire of his misanthropy. The primary evidence for this is his furious reaction to the exile of his friend, Hermodorus. The Ephesians, in a democratic fervor, had banished this man, who was likely a fellow aristocrat, with the declaration, "Let no one of us be best. If there is such a man, let him be so elsewhere and among others. For Heraclitus, this was the ultimate crime. It was the organized, legislated triumph of envious mediocrity over excellence. He saw it as a society deliberately cutting off its own head. His response was one of the most vitriolic curses in the history of philosophy. The Ephesians would do well to hang themselves, every adult man, and leave the city to be governed by boys, for they have cast out Hermodorus, the best man among them. This was not political commentary. It was a howl of aristocratic rage. He saw the democracy of Ephesus not as a noble experiment in freedom, but as the institutionalization of the mob's hatred for the superior individual. He loathed their laws, their assemblies, and their values. He believed they were fools who gorged themselves like cattle and were content with their ignorance. His war with the Ephesians was total. They were his personal antagonists, the living embodiment of the sleeping world he was trying to awaken with his intellectual thunderbolts. Every day he walked among them was a reminder of their deafness to his logos, and every interaction, real or imagined, only served to deepen the chasm between him and the rest of the human race. The contempt he felt for his fellow Greeks was matched only by the contempt he held for the alternative, the great barbarian power to the east. The saga of Heraclitus includes a fascinating, if possibly apocryphal, episode that reveals the depth of his rejection of all conventional power. According to Diogenes Laertius, the fame of the Ephesian sage reached the ears of the great king himself, Darius III of Persia. Impressed by his reputation for wisdom, Darius allegedly sent a letter to Heraclitus, inviting him to the royal court at Susa. The king offered him wealth, honor, and the chance to instruct him in Greek philosophy, complaining that his land lacked such men. For any other Greek of that era, this would have been a staggering opportunity. To become an advisor to the most powerful man in the known world was the pinnacle of ambition. Yet Heraclitus's reply was a masterpiece of philosophical scorn. He flatly refused. His purported letter to the king is a dismissal of all worldly ambition. "I shun all grandeur," he wrote, "as it is the companion of envy and vainglory." He declared that he was perfectly content with his paucity of possessions, living according to his own mind. Whether the exchange actually happened is debated by historians, but the story's endurance speaks volumes about his character. His refusal was not a patriotic act of a Greek defying a foreign tyrant. It was the act of a philosopher who placed himself above the petty distinctions of Greek and barbarian, king and commoner. He was rejecting the entire game of power politics. The court of the Persian king, with its rigid hierarchies and sycophantic courtiers, was just as repugnant to him as the democratic assembly of Ephesus with its envious mediocrity. Both were human systems, and he had already declared himself an outsider to all of them. He would not serve a king, because his only master was the Logos. His contemporaries gave him a nickname that has echoed through history: the Weeping Philosopher. This moniker, often contrasted with the laughing philosopher Democritus, provides a crucial window into the context of his personality and his reception. But why was he weeping? The later Roman writer Seneca interpreted it as a sign of compassion. He wept at the folly and wickedness of mankind, his heart heavy with their endless errors. But this sentimental interpretation feels profoundly at odds with the biting, arrogant tone of his surviving fragments. It is more likely that his tears were not of pity, but of sheer, unadulterated frustration. He was the weeping of a genius trapped in a world of fools, the exasperation of a man who held a cosmic truth in his hands and could find no one, absolutely no one who could comprehend its value. It was the weeping of utter intellectual loneliness. This image is deeply connected to his core philosophical doctrine of the soul. For Heraclitus, the ideal soul was dry. He believed moisture was antithetical to wisdom. A dry soul is wisest and best, he declared. A wet soul, clouded by emotion, drink, and bodily passions, was foolish and dim. His own quest was for this state of intellectual dryness, a pure, fiery intelligence. The irony is that his body would later betray him, succumbing to dropsy, the ultimate wet disease. But his moniker as the weeping philosopher paints a picture of a man whose inner dryness, his piercing intellect, was in a constant, sorrowful conflict with the wet, ignorant, passion-driven world around him. His tears were the rain produced when the fire of his mind met the damp fog of human stupidity. It was the grief of a king without a kingdom, a prophet without a people. The first cracks in his solitary fortress, the first signs that his intellectual pride would lead to total alienation, began to appear in the reception of his work. His book, lodged in the temple of Artemis, became an object of fascination and utter confusion. It did not spark a new school of thought or a wave of enlightenment. It created a legend of impenetrable obscurity. The reputation of his writing as a deliberate riddle began to overshadow its content. The anecdotes that have survived are telling. The great Athenian tragedian Euripides is said to have given a copy of Heraclitus's book to Socrates. When asked what he thought, Socrates delivered his famous verdict. "What I understood was excellent, and I believe what I did not understand is so too. But it would take a Delian diver to get to the bottom of it." A Delian diver was a specialist known for their ability to plunge to extreme depths. The comment is both a compliment and a profound criticism. It acknowledges the suspected depth of Heraclitus's thought, but also its inaccessibility. He had written a book that even the wisest man in Athens could not fully penetrate. This was the harbinger of his ultimate failure as a communicator. He had discovered the logos, the common principle that all should be able to grasp, but he had described it in a language so private, so idiosyncratic, that it functioned as a wall rather than a bridge. His pride in his own singular vision had led him to disdain the very act of clear communication. He did not want to be understood easily, but the result was that he was barely understood at all. The cracks were forming. His reputation was shifting from that of a wise man to that of the riddler, a performer of intellectual tricks, a man who, as Timon of Phlius later sneered, was a mob reveler who cackled in riddles. His greatest work was becoming a monument not to his wisdom, but to his obscurity. The final, fateful act that triggered his tragic end was a decision born of this lifetime of escalating contempt. It was his conscious and total retreat from human society. He did not simply become a recluse within the city, he abandoned it entirely. "Dogs bark at what they do not understand," he had written, and he had come to see the citizens of Ephesus as nothing more than a pack of yapping curs. His response was to leave the kennel. He turned his back on the marble colonnades, the bustling agora, the great temple, and walked out into the wilderness. The sources tell us he took to the mountains, choosing to live a life that was, in his view, more honest and elemental. He survived by eating what he could find, grass and plants, like a wild animal. This was not a spiritual retreat in the manner of a hermit seeking enlightenment. He believed he already possessed enlightenment. This was a physical manifestation of his philosophical verdict on humanity. He had judged mankind and found it wanting. He now preferred the company of beasts, whom he considered more authentic in their existence, to that of men, whom he saw as living a lie. This was the point of no return. By physically removing himself from the human world, he was making his internal state of alienation an external reality. He was attempting to live a life in perfect accordance with his philosophy, a life stripped of all convention, all society, all the wet, emotional baggage of human interaction. It was a grand, arrogant, and ultimately fatal gesture. He was testing his own ideal of the self-sufficient sage, the man who needed nothing but his own mind and the raw elements of nature. He was severing the final thread that connected him to the human race, a decision that would have devastating and ironic consequences for the philosopher who preached about the interconnectedness of all things. The greatest catastrophe for the man who celebrated the dry, fiery soul was the rebellion of his own body. In the isolation of the wilderness, his austere diet of wild plants took its toll. He developed dropsy, a condition known today as edema, where the body's tissues become waterlogged, causing grotesque and painful swelling. This was a catastrophe of supreme and bitter irony. Heraclitus, the champion of dryness, the man who believed wisdom resided in a soul free of moisture, was now physically drowning in his own fluids. The philosopher who saw the cosmos as an ever-living fire was being extinguished by a flood from within. His body, the physical vessel for his magnificent mind, had become a swamp, a perfect and horrifying metaphor for the wet world he so despised. This sickness was the physical manifestation of his philosophical choices, his rejection of society, his ascetic diet, his life in the harsh wilderness. It all conspired to destroy his health. The harmony of the cosmos, which he could perceive with such clarity, did not extend to the harmony of his own physiology. He could map the road up and down for the soul, but he had neglected the needs of his own corporeal existence. The sickness was a brutal refutation of his ideal of pure self-sufficiency. His mind, however powerful, could not command his failing kidneys. The sage who prided himself on understanding the hidden laws of nature was now a victim of its most basic biological processes. The greatest catastrophe was not a philosophical defeat, but a humiliating physical collapse, a defeat that would force the great misanthrope to do the one thing he found most repellent: return to the world of men and ask for help. His collapse was total, forcing a final, humiliating return to the city he had so proudly abandoned. He came down from the mountains, no longer a defiant sage, but a desperate, bloated patient, a walking embodiment of the wetness he loathed. This was his last chance, a final encounter with the society he had judged and condemned. But even in this state of abject need, his arrogance did not desert him. It shaped his final, fatal interaction. He sought out the physicians of Ephesus, the men of practical knowledge he had likely scorned in the past. But he could not bring himself to ask for help directly, to describe his symptoms in plain language. That would be an admission of vulnerability, a concession to the common world. Instead, he maintained his persona as the Riddler to the very end. He posed his condition to the doctors as an intellectual puzzle, an aphorism worthy of his own book. "Can you," he asked the baffled physicians, "make a drought after a rainstorm?" He was asking, in his infuriatingly cryptic way, if they could dry out the flood that was raging within his body. The physicians, practical men of medicine, not philosophers, had no idea what he was talking about. They stared at him in confusion. They could not solve the riddle, and in their failure, Heraclitus saw a final confirmation of his worldview. They were fools, just like all the rest. Their inability to understand his metaphor was, to him, proof of their incompetence. He dismissed them with contempt, his belief in the world's universal stupidity now sealed forever. This was the collapse. His pride made it impossible for him to receive help, even when his life depended on it. He chose to die in the fortress of his own intellectual superiority, rather than live by humbling himself before the men he considered his inferiors. The final scene of this saga is a descent into the depths of absurdity and horror, a finale that serves as the most grotesque and ironic footnote to a life of cosmic contemplation. Having dismissed the city's physicians as fools, Heraclitus takes his cure into his own hands, and his chosen method is a testament to his radical and now completely unhinged commitment to his own philosophy. He needed to counteract the wetness of his dropsy with extreme dryness and heat. His solution was as logical as it was insane. He went to a cowshed, a place of warmth and dry fermenting matter. There, he had himself buried in a pile of fresh cow manure, hoping the intense heat generated by the decomposing dung would act as a poultice, drawing the excess fluid from his swollen body. This is the hero's finale. The great aristocrat, the searcher of the soul's deepest logos, willingly encasing himself in animal excrement. The sensory details are overwhelming. The thick, warm, foul-smelling mass pressing in on him, the darkness, the suffocating stench. But the tragedy turns to black farce. He becomes trapped in the hardening dung, immobilized. And then, according to the most chilling version of the tale from Diogenes Laertius, the stray dogs of the city, no longer recognizing the human form beneath the filth, came upon him. The man who had once declared that dogs bark at what they do not understand met his end by being devoured by them. It is a death of unparalleled irony. The philosopher of fire is consumed not by flames, but by the slow, warm rot of manure. The misanthrope who preferred beasts to men is killed by them. The thinker who saw a hidden logos in all things dies in a manner that seems utterly random, squalid, and meaningless. It was the universe playing its final, cruelest joke on the man who thought he had figured it all out. In the immediate aftermath of his bizarre death, the legacy of Heraclitus was one of conflict and confusion. He left behind no school, no disciples to clarify his teachings, only a single, enigmatic book and the memory of a difficult, arrogant man. His contemporaries and immediate successors largely viewed him as a madman, a purveyor of willful obscurity. They mocked his aristocratic pride and his contempt for humanity. He was not a figure to be emulated, but a cautionary tale. Yet the sheer power and originality of his ideas were impossible to ignore. His work began a long, tortuous journey through the history of thought, where he was endlessly reinterpreted, each generation seeing in his fragments a mirror of their own concerns. Plato was both horrified and fascinated by him. The doctrine that everything flows posed a terrifying threat to Plato's search for eternal, unchanging forms, and much of Plato's philosophy can be read as a direct attempt to refute the Heraclitean vision of a universe in constant flux. His student Aristotle was more clinical, cataloging and analyzing Heraclitus's ideas, often critically, but acknowledging him as a significant early thinker on the nature of cause and change. It was the Stoics, centuries later, who resurrected Heraclitus as a hero. They saw in his concept of the logos and the cosmic fire a direct precursor to their own ideas of a universe governed by divine reason and periodic conflagrations. They transformed the angry misanthrope of Ephesus into a venerable founding father of their own school. This conflict of interpretations continued for centuries. The early church fathers saw in his logos a prefiguration of the Christian concept of the Word of God. And 2 millennia later, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would celebrate him as the ultimate tragic philosopher, an aristocratic spirit who had the courage to look into the chaotic heart of existence without flinching, a true predecessor to his own Dionysian worldview. Madman or genius, prophet or riddler, his legacy remains a battleground, a testament to a mind too potent to be easily categorized. So we return to the central dramatic paradox, the core question of his life. Why did the man who perceived the hidden harmony of the universe live a life of such profound discord? What was it that broke him? The final comprehensive answer is that Heraclitus was not broken by his enemies, or by fate, or by the ignorance of the Ephesians. He was consumed by the very fire of his own discovery. His genius was his tragedy. To grasp the Logos as he did was to see the world from a cosmic perspective, a viewpoint from which the everyday concerns of humanity, its politics, its religions, its hopes and fears, appeared not just insignificant, but utterly absurd. Imagine discovering the laws of thermodynamics and then being forced to listen to people argue about which pagan ritual will best ensure a good harvest. The gulf is too vast. His discovery was so profound, so all-encompassing, that it made the mundane world of human affairs unbearable. It was an intellectual fire that provided immense light, but also generated an unbearable heat, scorching away his capacity for empathy, for patience, for simple human connection. He wasn't a weeping philosopher out of pity. He was weeping out of the sheer frustration of being a god trapped in the body of a man, forced to live among a species he saw as little more than talking animals. The fire that he identified as the essence of the universe, an ever-living fire, with measures of it kindling and measures going out, was the same fire that burned within his own soul. It gave him unparalleled insight, but it had no off switch. It burned away his relationships, his social standing, and ultimately, his sanity and his life. He was not an outcast because the world rejected him. He was an outcast because his vision rejected the world. The verdict of history on Heraclitus of Ephesus is that he was the ultimate unheard prophet. His life stands as a timeless and terrifying lesson about the nature of genius and the immense difficulty of communicating a revolutionary truth to a world that is not ready to hear it. He gave Western civilization its fundamental intellectual toolkit, the idea of a universe in a constant state of flux and becoming, the concept of a unifying principle, logos, that underlies the chaos, the profound insight that reality is forged in the tension of opposites. These are not footnotes in the history of philosophy. They are the very bedrock of dialectical thinking, influencing everyone from Plato to Hegel to modern physics. He provided the blueprint for understanding reality not as a collection of static objects, but as a dynamic, interconnected process. Yet, the price for this monumental contribution was his complete and utter personal ruin. He demonstrates the eternal tragedy of the visionary who is centuries ahead of their time. His message was too radical, his language too compressed, his personality too abrasive for the audience he was given. He was a man who saw the matrix, but could no longer relate to the people living inside it. The universal lesson of his life is a stark warning about the relationship between knowledge and life. It suggests that there may be truths so vast, so alien to the human condition, that to grasp them is to be irrevocably severed from that condition. He solved the riddle of the cosmos, but in doing so he became a riddle to himself and everyone around him, a prophet whose words could only be understood once he himself was long dead and gone. Our final frame is not the pathetic image of his death in dung, but the enduring symbol he gave to the world, the one that best captures his magnificent, terrible vision. We are back at the great temple of Artemis, where his single scroll lies in the cool, silent sanctuary. Outside, on a great altar, burns a sacred flame, a fire that is never allowed to die. The flame flickers and dances, its shape constantly changing from one moment to the next. Yet the fire itself remains. It is a thing of perpetual motion that is simultaneously a symbol of constancy. This is the final, powerful image of Heraclitus's universe. This cosmos, the same for all, none of gods or men has made, but it was ever, is now, and ever shall be an ever-living fire. This flame is his logos, his vision of reality as a dynamic, self-ordering process. It is the fire of strife that is also the source of harmony. It is the fire of intellect that illuminates the darkest corners of existence. It is the fire that burned so brightly in the mind of one man that it consumed his mortal life, reducing his personal story to ashes. But the light from that fire, the ideas he forged within it, traveled out from that temple across the centuries, illuminating the entire course of Western thought. The man was gone, a tragic failure. The fire lives on,